Thank you for inviting me to talk about our research project, which is based on the results of a European study performed by Nicola Disma, which is the evaluation of the morbidity and mortality after anesthesia in early life, the NECTARINE study, supported by the European Society of Anesthesiology. An original study included 160 centers, including 6,000 anesthesias, in evaluating the postoperative follow-up and mortality of neonates undergoing anesthesia. To go into more details of one of the major diseases, we performed a sub-study of neonates undergoing anesthesia for esophageal atresia repair. The study focused on esophageal atresia, which is a congenital malformation present in 2.5 up to 10,000 living births. It's classified by the Graaff classification, which shows that there might be esophageal atresia in combination with a fistula between the esophagus and the trachea. Most children have class C, which is present in 82% of the children, in which there is a distal blind sac of the esophagus and the fistula between the trachea and the distal part of the esophagus, which is connected to the stomach. It's a life-threatening disease which requires early operation, mostly within 3 days after being birthed. Mortality is quite high, with a mortality rate of 5 to 10%. And the risk factors, which are known thus far for esophageal atresia, are prematurity, low birth weight, and other associated congenital abnormalities which are present. The surgical anesthesia management consists of two phases. The first phase is the tracheo-bronchoscopy for the identification of the location of the fistula, which can be performed by rigid or flexible bronchoscopy. And the second phase is surgical correction, which is first the ligation of the fistula, and the next step is the continuation restoration with an end-to-end anastomosis of the esophagus. The surgical part involves a right-side surgical approach with an open or thoracoscopic approach. This requires a single lung ventilation, and the position of the tube is quite crucial because it's important to know whether the tube is before or after the fistula, and there are some arguments before a cuffed or uncuffed tube. Furthermore, there's compression of the lung and also compression of the venous side, venous reflux, which might give hemodynamic instabilities. Consequently, there are some metabolic derangements during the anesthesia, which are mostly hypercapnia, hypoxia, and respiratory acidosis. The aim of the study was to describe the perioperative management of esophageal atresia of a fistula and to investigate whether there are patient surgical and anesthetic factors that affect the incidence of perioperative clinical incidents and post-operative complications and mortality. From those NECTARINE study, we included 144 procedures, which were included in 77 centers. Most importantly are the baseline characteristics, which showed that most children had born not premature, with a birth weight of somewhat less than 3 kilograms, with a quite good APGAR score. And most surgeries were performed within 3 days after being born. The weight of surgery was between 2.5 to 3 kilograms in most of the children, or higher. And most of the children had no ventilatory or oxygen support before the surgery. And most of them had no cardiac problems before the anesthesia. Anesthesia was mostly maintained by inhalation anesthesia in more than 90% of the patients. And the duration of anesthesia lasts for 250 minutes median. In most of the patients, there were 90% of patients, the duration of anesthesia was more than 2 hours. Most of the patients were operated with an open procedure, and only 40% of the patients were operated with a thoracoscopic approach. Importantly is that 70% of the patients required had at least one perioperative critical event which required intervention by the anesthesiologist, which were mostly related to the interventions for oxygenation in 45% of the cases, and in 34% of the cases required for circulatory hypercapnia, and 41% for circulatory problems during the anesthetic procedure. Most of the children, 95% of the children, were admitted to the post-operative intensive care after the anesthesia and had an admission period of about 18 days, of which 5 days were on the ventilator. Post-operative mortality, 30-day mortality was 2.1%, and the 90-day post-operative mortality was 2.8%. The present results show a very large variation in the surgical and anesthetic clinical approach. Furthermore, it illustrates the complexity of the procedure, and it illustrates a high incidence of respiratory and circulatory perioperative complications, which results in a prolonged stay at the intensive care, and a substantial mortality. These results illustrate that centralization of care for these complex procedures are necessary. The strength of the study is it's the first study in Europe which illustrates the complexity of the procedure in a prospective way. The limitations of the present study are that it's the mixed group with an unknown classification of esophageal atresia, and furthermore, we didn't have detailed information about the situation before the surgery. The next step in research would be an observational prospective cohort study more focused on esophageal atresia, in which we hope to gain more information about respiratory and metabolic abnormalities during the procedure. And we could also investigate by doing that the difference between an open and scopic procedure. This study must preferably be done in collaboration with the surgeons.